wellnesscouch.com, streaming wellness into your lives.
Welcome to Nourishing the Mother, featuring your hosts Bridget Wood and Julie Tenner.
Hello and welcome to Nourishing the Mother. I'm Bridget Wood.
I'm Julie Tenner, and today we are going to look at the seductress archetype, what it is to be seductive, what it is to be sensual and sexual in our modern day culture, and what that means for our kids. But before we get there, we just want to mention to you our retreat that we have coming up on the 8th of November, which is a really big delve, a whole day of divinely delving into our feminine, our history as women and mothers, where we're sitting in our happiness and our joy and our bliss and our sexuality at the moment, and how we can really move to reconnect with ourselves, our purpose, our soul, and definitely get back in love with being the mother that we want to be. So, Bridget, I'm going to hand over to you.
Yeah, so this is an interesting one. It's kind of come about. I recently did a film for Suburban Sandcastles, which was called The Mask You Live In, and it's all about representations of masculinity. And the producers of that film, previous to creating this one, created a film called Misrepresentation, with the objective being to illustrate how much our culture objectifies women and sort of sexualizes girls and holds women up to unrealistic expectations of themselves through media and through advertising. But part of me was really not sitting right with doing that film, because I really felt like unrealistically suggesting that women shouldn't want to be sexual, or women shouldn't want to awaken that part of themselves that is very sensual outwardly, that we'd almost be cutting off a part of ourselves if we were to deny that. And it really got me thinking about, that whole concept of, videos, like music videos that objectify women, like, Christina Aguilera's videos from, 10 years ago. And that whole, her gyrating on a stage, singing Dirty. And how on one hand we love that because it's so expressive and we love to dance to a song like that. But I myself have sort of almost felt like that's wrong, because we're told that, that's kind of lowbrow, or we're, objectifying women, and that, like, who are we to sort of stand up there and just be, flesh up there dancing. But this really comes back to this concept of, we're really on the theme of exploring archetypes at the moment, and it comes back to this archetype of the seductress, that, that sensual woman, and we really need that part of ourselves to tap into our sexuality and awaken the true potential of our sexuality. And Jules, I know you've explored a lot on that archetype, so I'd love to hear your perspective on it.
I don't know, I find it really tricky because I look at it as a woman moving through that. So what is our disconnection to our sensual side, and why do we reject that? Then we look at our pop culture of pornography, that so much of our children's experience growing up, and certainly even our own initiation into a sexual, sensual life, was through the archetype of the porn star.
Yeah.
So is that really what is honouring the feminine, and does that cover the feminine? No, it doesn't. It's a very masculine representation of sensuality and sexual, it's not even sensual, of sexuality. And so already we've started the dying away and the unknowing of what it is to be feminine and what it is to explore sensuality, our own sensuality, and connect with the juiciness and the joy and the bliss, and even the comfort level that we have with our own menstrual cycles and our own juiciness. Is how much are we willing to even connect with that? And so I think the level that you feel comfortable with, if I say things like luscious, juicy vagina, probably says to me how connected you are to that aspect of your femininity, because that in itself is part of the problem with that culture, is that it becomes so about the doing and the being and the looking this way that it completely removes the feeling and the receiving. And
perhaps, is it that our society, we're almost over-sexualized outwardly because we're overcompensating for the fact that we're disconnected internally?
Yes.
That there's that outward representation of sex because we're not having that within ourselves. We're not connecting with that in ourselves. We're not embodying that. So we're trying to be that outwardly in the hope that we will somehow internalize that.
I feel like for the most part women don't know what that path is. They go, I get that I'm not orgasming, or that I kind of just have sex but it's kind of perfunctory, or that I don't really enjoy my sensual self. And I even look at my own story sometimes and pull that apart and think, when was the point in my life that I decided now I'm not allowed to show my breasts? Now I have to wear high cut tops and I can no longer wear low cut ones, and I can't wear a mini skirt anymore. And when was the point that I even decided in my own femininity that I was going to reject it and not I guess, sit and embody that side of myself. In fact, turn my back from it and go, well, now I'm just going to wear this and look like this and therefore embody that because that's more acceptable to me and to everyone else. When was that point that happened, and why was that so culturally acceptable? And why do I not have around me women that represent that path of sensuality?
Also, and why do most people never question that either? Never go back and look at what point did that change and at what point did I feel that this was the right way? Or that it wasn't okay to show my breasts, in my view. Yes,
no, exactly, totally. And then I think we look at, women that we see around us that, a woman that's really sitting so deeply in her sensuality, not even sexuality, in her sensuality, is completely free. There's something magnetic about her, and I'm sure we've all met these women at parties or in various social circles, and she's magnetic. You can't stop staring at her. Maybe you even judge her because you're a little bit jealous. Maybe she's wearing something tight and sexy and slinky because she's feeling it.
Yeah.
Or maybe she's not. And maybe she's laughing and she's so free-spirited and luscious that you can't help but want a little bit of that.
Yeah.
And the men kind of buzz around her like honeycomb, and it doesn't matter that, she might have spider veins up her legs and maybe she's not the prettiest girl in the room. There's something that's so deeply sensual, feminine, connecting just unapologetically.
It's almost
with
like a congruency within all parts of herself.
Yeah, a total acceptance.
Yeah,
and not even. It's even for me, it's more than that. It's this really deep, just knowing of the power that her connection to her sensuality has, and flirtation is even part of that. In flirting, not to the point of. Flirting not for the purpose of sex, but flirting for the purpose of being able to gain pleasure in any moment. So being able to be present in a moment and receive, again, the word receive, which is very feminine, as opposed to the masculine, which is to get to do. So to receive pleasure in any moment, because flirtation is very pleasurable and very much a feminine, womanly art. And we certainly know that we've grown up with those stories of women not being the head of the household, but of kind of manipulating the way that things happened or went by using those feminine arts, which is using their sensuality, because you can't deny it and you can't say no to it and you kind of want it.
It's inherent, really, and often we're using it unconsciously, but how fantastic to consciously awaken that at any moment, which we certainly have the capacity to do when we connect in.
We do, exactly. And I really feel like that's missing so much in our culture, is we just have sexuality as sex and this very male version of the doing side of it, as opposed to...
And outcome-driven.
Yes.
Which is very masculine.
Isn't it? As opposed to the very female version of sensuality, which is pleasure. So why do we deny ourselves pleasure? Why do we put ourselves on calorie restricting diets, or that we only allow ourselves to wear this type of underwear or this type of clothing, or go to these sorts of places, or watch these sorts of films, or judge those sorts of films? I'm actually even having a flashback to, I had a girls' weekend away with a whole group of mums, from, so it was like 14 of us, and Magic Mike #2 had just come out, and a girlfriend and I from that group were just, we were loving it. We were just finding it so hysterically funny, and we were just loving the whole vibe. We were going. But that in itself was really confrontational, I noticed, for some of those women that were there, because there were a lot that didn't go, nah, it's not for me. No, why would I see that film? And it was, for me, that was just part of that. I was quite happy just to be luscious and joyful, and I wasn't going because I wanted to, drool over this man. I was going because I just wanted to have some fun and connect with something that was funny and sexy, and own laughter is therapy.
Yes.
And laughter is a woman, what laughter is the point of women being in their sensual state. To be able to laugh is to be able to let go, because you have to let air out and you have to let air in, and sometimes you snort and sometimes your body moves in different ways, and you have to be really centrally, pleasurably centered
and
to
present.
be able to wholeheartedly laugh.
Yeah.
And wholehearted laughter is a part of sensuality in the divine feminine. So where are you not allowing the pleasure and the laughter in your life? And why is something even as what was for me as funny and simplistic as a Magic Mike like out of that came so many lewd jokes and, just horrendous statements that you'd never think of saying, but they were so funny. It allowed all of us
Yeah.
in that house the freedom to let go and be and laugh at sexuality and sit in
A real icebreaker.
Well, yeah, and sit in a real, ancient truth-telling, feminine, connective space. I don't know, I feel like there's something in that.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I haven't seen Magic Mike, but yeah, I have heard a lot about it, and just definitely it sounds almost like a perfect kind of, very silly, feminine, opportunity to just go into the silliness, and really just, I don't know.
Yeah, and that's what ancient feminine circles were. They were always about, the men, getting the men, I'm sure, on some level to disappear into fishing trips, because there's something about women that
women
they
coming together.
They have an inner driver to want to be together, and whether that's just being in the feminine on your own, or whether that's being in the feminine with a group of women, when they really come together in a real truth-telling way, there's a lot of, belly-telling. Well, we're talking about stories, ancient fables and stories from last week's podcast, and that's what women would do. They would come together with these really lewd stories, because it allowed a space and a route and a path to the connection of the sensuality and the sexuality through laughter.
And I really want to talk about how this is not sort of a judgment on women at an individual level, but rather really looking at how it is that we have become so disconnected, and how we have come to view sexuality almost as, those outward expressions of it as almost dirty or wrong, or in judgment of women who do that. And a lot of it comes back to, as we explored in a podcast a couple of weeks ago with Elle Griffin, is the dominance of the church on our society and our views of what's acceptable in society. The expansion of the Catholic Church really, really relied on the nuclear family and the idea of, having lots of children and subordination and, really almost demonizing sex unless it was within the family unit. And even then it was never really talked about, because, sex was about empowerment, and the church was into overpowering populations.
Well, it was never about connecting with the sensual side. It was always about sex being for the purpose of conceiving.
Yes, it was all, again, outcome driven. Yes. It's that masculine way. It was never about, allowing ourselves the pleasure in it.
No, it was denying pleasure.
It was all about, okay, how many children can you have so we can spread our word.
And again, we come back to women are so culturally ingrained to deny themselves pleasure. And therefore you can't ever reach connection with your sensual side unless you're willing to honour your need for pleasure.
And even, some women will often say probably they've become used to not getting that, in a physical sense. But perhaps it's, there's a real question to ask there about, well, there must be some underlying, perhaps, frustration there, there's something not quite there.
I think like the maiden that we talked about in archetypes last week, there's a knowing. There's a knowing that there's something more, and a driver to want to get there.
But not knowing
how. You got to remember, generally I think women are not surrounded by role models or the path, or necessarily even that they would allow themselves to seek the more.
And who do you go to?
Exactly.
Who do you trust enough to have those conversations with?
Someone who even has the knowledge.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
it's been so culturally ingrained out of us. We no longer have generational, handing down of womanly arts the way that we would have centuries ago. Other than the birds and the bees talk, that was very much about the route to pregnancy, there was nothing further from my mother.
And yet this is actually the key to awakening the strength of a woman, the strength of a girl, the strength of a teenager, going through those life transitions where there's so much peer pressure. If you can awaken your child's connection with herself and deep inner knowing and trust, and trusting her with her sexuality and allowing her to grow into that and own that, and that not be something to be afraid of, then isn't that the best way to send her out in the world? That means
the gift you could give her.
The gift you could give her. We talk so much about, issues at the moment in the news around domestic violence, or, all of this stuff around women being downtrodden, but really, I think so much of it's about changing the conversation that we have with our girls, and helping them to think critically about the society that tells them how they should be. as
how
girls.
they should behave and what that should look like.
Yeah.
When it's actually not a representation of the feminine at all.
No.
It's a representation of the masculine. But in order for our daughters to gain that knowledge, we as their mothers have to be willing to embody that knowledge.
And to embody that, we need to do that journey ourselves.
That's exactly right. I mean, that's kind of the purpose of our retreats, isn't it? That's how we came to it, was that part of our journey through reconnecting with ourselves and our pleasure and our joy was through reconnecting with our sensuality and removing the barriers to it, removing the barriers that we put up and that we perceive are there for receiving of pleasure. So, that's a major theme, isn't it?
Absolutely.
I keep thinking about this story, Bridget, that you told me weeks ago when we were discussing sexuality, and you were saying it's like the daughter that is displaying very sexualized behavior, and the therapist, instead of looking at fixing the daughter, looks at the parents and says to either one of them or both of them, what's happening in your
family.
sex life.
Yeah, and that's really based on this concept of the law of conservation, which a family unit demonstrates beautifully because nothing's missing in a family. So, in a family you'll always have somebody sort of fighting, or there'll always be conflict. It's impossible to always have harmony. And so similarly, in a family with sexuality, there'll always be somebody repressing it or somebody not expressing it and somebody who is expressing it. So we have, children, girls, you look at this Khloe Kardashian's kids line that's come out in Big W, which some people are, up in arms about. But even though I know she's not sexualizing toddlers, but the idea is that that's still a sexualization of children. And this is happening on a wide scale, this concept of girls kind of jumping into that femininity so young. But it's ultimately a reflection of the adults who are repressing it. The children are expressing it because we have not become comfortable in our adulthood with this. And it's really as a result of that conscious or unconscious patterning to do with, those old societal views on sex and the church and, just kind of buttoning up.
And also our generational disconnection from the feminine. It's not only that we have those cultural belief overlays, it's that we've completely dismantled our path towards them. And,
children really are, if you don't have the role model for something, then you don't know it. It's not something unless... there needs to be something around you that helps you to awaken it within. Everyone has everything. It's about what's awakened for you. And for most of us, our mothers weren't able to give that to us because their mothers weren't able to give that to them.
And they could never own it in themselves.
No.
And that was the point of this story you were telling me. So the therapist says to the parents, where is your sensuality and sexuality at? And potentially they sort out, we're having sex once a month. Or
not even.
Or that woman is completely disconnected to her own sense of self and pleasure and sensual orgasmic self.
Yes. And the child, and so as soon as the parents started to go and have sex again, the child's behaviour calms down.
Yeah, without doing anything to the child.
Nothing to the child.
It's about shifting the energetic or the ownership of where that sexuality is sitting in that space, and therefore how connected to the central side is that mother.
Yeah, absolutely. And and knowing too that yes, that girl might have been expressing it, sort of gyrating around the living room to some song or whatever, but that doesn't necessarily mean that she was really deeply connected with it either. So there's still that work to do, isn't there? There's still that work that we all have as parents to do to help give both boys and girls that more healthy ability to express sexuality and explore it in a way that's safe and in a way that's empowering.
Yeah, which again, like you were saying from our last week's podcast, was coming back to our intuition, but then also in owning our own barriers to pleasure and owning our own sensuality, we provide the path to the path of sexuality that is respectful and doesn't allow for abuse. Yes.
And that really reminds me actually of the interview that I did with Dr. Anna Rubinstein, who is an author and a doctor and runs these rites of passage retreats. And he gave me a horrible statistic on the influence these days of pornography on young boys and also on the kind of sex that's happening between teenagers, and that in fact girls are actually representing to doctor's surgery with injury from sex.
Yeah,
because
it's horrifying, isn't it?
Because boys don't have any other reference for what sex is except for porn.
And neither do girls, and you've got the shades of grey as well. I imagine part of that has really come out of that as well, is that if you want to really explore your sexuality,
it's all S&M or whatever.
Yes, it becomes the the kinky, the verging on where do I sit with this without knowing myself truly and wholly, and how to receive and what is sensuality. And for me, Shades of Grey even goes beyond that. Like, this is really almost the perfect archetype of how far we've come, that we cannot receive pleasure without being tied up and forced to. And that for me speaks volumes, because every woman I know is to some extent fascinated about that. Whether they've read the books or not, there's a concept within that Shades of Grey that they are fascinated about. Part of me thinks it's the white knight syndrome, which we pulled apart in last week's archetype. But the other part of me thinks there's part of this thing of not allowing themselves to receive pleasure to such an extent that they must be forced to, or else they cannot do it themselves. But also out of that is coming, I'm going to say, ideas for teenagers on how to explore their sexuality. And then you're coming up with these incredible statistics that Dr. Rubenstein came up with, which was something ridiculous, like however many fold. Do you remember what the statistic was?
I can't even remember.
However many fold times amount of sexual injuries are now presenting in the ER, which is horrifying. That is the route of initiation for our daughters into sexuality.
And for our boys, it's a really, I think about having a son and thinking about, is that the kind of, view of sexuality that we want him to grow up with? Surely that these boys can't feel right in themselves to be expressing themselves sexually in that way, but that it's just an injected belief or an injected sort of way of doing things that it's become so entrenched that they're less capable of sitting with it, of exploring it, because
they can't even allow themselves to explore their sensuality because they see it as, if you want to please a woman, this is how you do it.
Yeah.
Which, of course, it isn't at all.
No.
But it really hones in on where our culture has really got to. And then when we come full circle back to the Seductress, why are we so uncomfortable with outward displays of sexuality in forms of how women expose their bodies, how they have ownership over their sexuality in the way that they, let's say, display that in our culture, perhaps how flirtatious they are. How do we as a group of women in our community judge that? How do we connect or disconnect with that, and why is that there?
And what comes up for us when we see a woman who is that? Is it jealousy? Is it, disdain? Is it judgment? Is it, gratitude, for her beauty?
Because it actually then says to you where you are sitting on your journey with your connection to your sensuality is based on what it is that you're seeing, perceiving, and therefore judging in that other is actually what you're not perceiving or owning within yourself. And therefore, if you want a bit more of whatever it is that she's offering you, you actually have to do the reverse as opposed to projecting. You've got to go inwardly, how can I take a little bit of whatever the archetype is that she represents into myself? And that doesn't need to be as extreme as, well, now I'm buying a push-up bra, I'm wearing a low-cut top. That's not what I'm saying.
No.
What I'm saying is, maybe you allow a little bit more pleasure in your day. So maybe rather than starting breakfast with a black coffee and running out the door, what if you spent time to really enjoy and sensually experience with sight, taste and sound your breakfast that you've lovingly prepared.
Eat your breakfast without doing anything else. Just
that
eat
in
your
itself
breakfast.
is a gift. You've got to think about yourself in this seductress archetype as also being a goddess. And what do we think about when we think about the goddess as an archetype? We think about her being honoured, we think about her being veiled and fed, and she isn't needy, and she doesn't need a man, and she doesn't need to ask. She's just there to receive.
She just is. She's awakened. She's completely connected with herself.
And you want to gift that magnificence. You want to sit in it. You want to look at it. You want to be part of it. But you also want to feed it. You want to fuel it. And so you've got to also see in yourself where that is within you. And therefore, what is it that you need to feed in your soul and in your body and in your life to allow yourself to be sensual?
And really sit with it and own it. And explore it, because that's a beautiful thing. Everybody around us is helping us to awaken a part of ourselves or own a part of ourselves. And so when you do see those people, it's an opportunity to ask yourself, where am I doing that, or where do I have the potential to express that? Because we all have it.
We all do. And it's really hard. How do we teach? I know that you had come to me with a question, Bridget, on how do you teach your son how to not objectify women when we're looking at video clips that are all about the sexy, the slutty, and the, I don't know, how much gyrating can I do in a film clip.
Yeah.
And also in the songs. So there's lots of pop songs that have the most hideous lyrics to them.
Don't they?
They're awful. But for some reason, there's something that is fascinating or connecting about some or all of those songs for any one of us.
Yeah.
And, you know, I even have mums at school that I sit really differently on that with, because I don't I allow my son to listen to whatever music he wants to listen to, and I sit with it in place of music therapy. So if there's a beat or a tune or a a construct that he's really feeling in his body, and he's very much the person that will express that by dancing and really owning, I feel like that's his masculine version of owning his femininity, is through movement and dance.
Yes.
And I love that he can connect to his feminine through connection with music. So therefore, I don't actually care, in a way, what music he listens to and what the lyrics are, because they will mean something very different to him to what they mean to me.
Yes.
But also, it's not necessarily the lyrics. There's just something about the suggestion in those songs that he's connecting with. Now, of course, I still have discussions with him, which we're doing at the moment, about, you know, appropriate use of swear language, and, you know, where we when it's okay for certain ages and people and places to use that, and when it's not.
Yeah.
And that I expect that level of behaviour from him. And we are constantly having discussions about the sensuality and the sexuality and the femininity in very small, bite-sized pieces that are at his age level. And so I know that you would come to me and say, but how are you going to teach this? How do you allow him to, you know, see or experience these things in the world and not expect that he's going to come out of that with the negative version of, you know, what it is that we're really rallying against in femininity? And to be honest, I don't really know. I'm kind of figuring it out as I go. But part of me is really sitting with, and I can see he's nearly 10 now, and even the Bonds ads come on, and I can see there's something that's a bit fascinating. And all of the kids around him at the moment are kind of toying with the idea of boyfriends and girlfriends. It's still too scary, and I don't want to know about it, but I'll joke about it and I'll muck around with it a little bit. So there's something that's already instinctually enticing them into the sensual ownership of themselves. And I feel like it's really crucial how we handle that.
Absolutely. Those conversations are so, it's just such
But even the way we respond to the way to what they're displaying or looking at or viewing, I feel has the potential to be damaging and crippling as much as it has the potential to be, I don't know, explosive and honouring on that future adult.
I think it's really key to just not necessarily react like you might be to shut down something like that or explain it away. Like, I think it's a real opportunity to unpack, you know, isn't it?
Yeah, I really think so. I haven't figured out the perfect way to do it. But I did come across, and I did want to read this article that I know I'd read to you earlier, that I came across actually on Al Griffin's blog, the, not blog, magazine, the Over the Moon magazine. I have read so many articles on there, I don't even know where I got this snippet from, but this story sat so deeply with me and really speaks about how we view the feminine with our boys. Yes. And so I really wanted to read that to our listeners.
Yeah, go for it.
So this is a story about a mum who's sitting in the hairdressers, and her son is in the hairdressers with her. And next to her on the table is a coffee book that's full of images and posters of pin-up girls from the 1950s. And I don't know about you, but I'm really fascinated by even those pictures themselves. They're not necessarily the pornography that we have now, but they were kind of the version of pornography back in the 1950s. So you've got to kind of get context of that we're kind of looking at the same images, just a little bit differently. But there's something about those 1950 pin-up girls that are just, they're irresistible, and they're
so enticing.
Oh, so enticing. That's really that deep feminine seductress archetype almost for me is what those 1950s pin-up girls are. There's something fascinating about them. It doesn't matter that they're not fully undressed or whatever. There's something so alluring.
It's even the way they hold themselves.
Yes, it is, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's almost the goddess, isn't it, in that. Anyway, so this mum's at the hairdressers. She's flicked through this book of beautiful women in pin-up style, and she's popped it down. And her son, who's 8 or 9 at the time, sees her put it down, and there's something that she can register he's a little bit fascinated by. So he kind of teeters over there, and he kind of lifts the cover a little bit, checks no one's watching, and shuts it again. But then he can't help himself, and he's back again, and he's flipping the pages up just a little bit just to kind of see a little bit more. And she just sees it, and she decides to let it go, allow him to explore whatever it is that he's fascinated by, and have the discussion with him later. So this is then this mother's walking out into this car park after the hairdressers with her son, and she chooses now to start the conversation with him. So she says, Did you think the women inside were beautiful? He nods and shrugs again, but I could feel his words were just around the corner. I reached for his hand to bring him closer to me. He silently shared his curiosity and the enchanting effect the women had on him. He wondered if he'd done something wrong by peeping into a grown-up only zone. The purity of his discovery was worthy of a thoughtful, measured response. I didn't have one of those. I had a glorious sunset instead. All of the cars in the parking lot sort of blurred away against the sight of the early evening sky. It was fluorescent and shouted to me all the answers I wanted for this beautiful little boy. Do you see those colours in the sky? He did. When you look at the beauty of the light and the clouds, it makes you feel warm and happy. That's just like a woman. We were created for beauty with our bodies and our hearts. We make people feel love when we know that we're beautiful like the sunset. He looked into me with his old soul eyes. This was one of those moments when angels pressed play. I just love it. I can't understand. I held on to that quote because I feel like I'm going to keep coming back to it because there's so much in there that just says it's okay for women to be sensual and sexy and for you to be fascinated by their gloriousness, but know that it's glorious and it's beautiful and that it radiates from within as much as you can see it from without.
Yeah. Oh, and that's magic.
Isn't it? And I kind of feel that story also highlights, it doesn't matter if it's the 1950s pinup girl or it's, I don't know, Rihanna in a film clip.
Yeah.
It's looking at women in the same way that women can be this, but they can also be this. And they are all of these things in a spectrum and not ever one of those things. And as a male, it's your role to witness that, to love it and adore it. And in a way, feed it, but not in a masculine way, just in a way of reverence and respect.
Reverence is a really key word here, I think. You know, there are, you know, you see those figures of men. I think maybe Hugh Jackman's one of them, who's really kind of a whole man. You know, he's embraced his feminine and his masculine side, and he sits in reverence for women.
I love Hugh Jackman.
He's a man's man and he's a woman's man.
So true.
Like
that's pretty rare, actually. Isn't it?
Yeah.
And you're right. It's because he's really able to move through and embody in a really safe way because he's an actor, the feminine and the masculine. Whereas how many men or boys get the opportunity to really embody the feminine in our day-to-day world?
No. And I think also he's also with a very empowered woman. You know, his wife is very empowered in her own right. You know, and they're both able to really be quite influential. You know, and have a really beautiful partnership that's, you know, equally empowered, you know, and whole. But yeah, that's just the first time you read that to me, I had tears. Like that.
I fight back tears every time I read it because it is so loaded with all of this gifting that this mother and wisdom that her divine feminine mother wants to hand on to her, you know, naive, beautiful masculine who's about to enter his next journey into, who knows, becoming the prince, as from our previous podcast. But, you know, she doesn't know what those words, she feels them, but she doesn't know what those words are and she doesn't know how to hand them over. And instead she chooses such a magnificent example that is so connected with the divine and the universe and in everything that he sees as a representation of the feminine. And I kind of just love it.
I think it's beautiful, but too, because it's not her trying to hand down her projected view of something, which I think can often happen as parents, you know, like we often sort of hand down what we think's right, you know, and it really frames our child's view of the world, and that's just what's going to happen. It's no way of avoiding that, but when we can choose, you know, mindfully, those conversations and those words, that's just magic.
I so agree. I feel like we've run out of time now for exploring Seductress, but I do feel like we're going to come back to it because there's a whole load on connecting with our sensuality and our sexuality to come. And certainly if you feel this is really an area that you would love to embody more, how to be seductive, how to live your life from the point of seduction, and how to enchant yourself with the ancient feminine art forms that probably generationally have been lost. That's really going to be a big part of our retreat. So please connect with us on facebook.com/nourishingthemother, and Bridget through suburbansandcastles.com. And your movie's coming up.
Yeah, I've got a couple of movies coming up. In September it's The Connection, and in October it is The Empowerment Project, which is all about empowering women and women kind of taking their own journeys through exploring a whole range of different careers and life choices and avenues. So it's going to be a really great celebration of women.
Sounds completely perfect. And for soul sessions, for unpacking your journey as a woman and a mother, please connect with me on naturopathicbirth.com.au. So until next week, we hope you find some pleasure in your day that you can keep just for yourself, even if it's just a quiet cup of tea.
This has been a production of TheWellnessCouch.com. Check us out on Facebook and join in the conversation on Facebook.com/TheWellnessCouch. Subscribe to each show on iTunes and check us out on Twitter. The Wellness Couch, streaming wellness into your lives. Whilst the Wellness Couch presenter endeavor to provide accurate and helpful information to their listeners, these podcasts cannot take into account individual circumstances and are not intended to be a substitute for health and medical advice from a qualified health professional. You should always seek the advice of a qualified health professional before acting on any of the information provided by any of the Wellness Couch podcasts.